Cool. Do we want to jump in with a round of check-ins? I can go first. I went and saw a community play last night, which was a musical of all these sort of Snow White and a montage of a whole bunch of sort of fairy tale themes, which a friend of ours was in, which was kind of bizarre, and it's put me in a strange space this morning. It's like, oh wow, where's the wolves and the giants and the singing princes and whatnot? And yeah, I've just been reviewing the ideas for today, and yeah, it's quite excited by the content and curious to see where everyone's at with their progress in their team. So yeah, quite looking forward to the session. That's me. I'll go with Josh.
Okay, I can go. I'm feeling good. Just got basically all the projects created for the last developer program, but just got some news on the metrics for the current registration, and our numbers are like way lower than expected. So that's kind of like on my mind, thinking about what to do about that. But yeah, I'll go over to the other Josh.
Yeah, I second Josh. Both of us are on that thread. I was quite concerned about this. I actually flagged this previously. I said this was a concern because we were telling people there's the same program for two different prices. And as a developer myself and quite a frugal person, I was like, I would definitely go for the cheaper one. Without a doubt, I finished the whole developer program in like half a day just because I like to watch it at 2x speed. So and I said it like 20 times and no one really took me seriously. And then Dean and I spoke about it and I was like, dude, I don't feel good about this. And yet we did it anyways. As the executioner of stuff, I ended up doing it. But now the repercussions seem to be coming back to bite us in the butt. So I'm glad Dean is flagging it and I'm excited to have Dean as part of our team. I'm happy that he's like bringing this up before the program registration period ends, which is what happened last time. And I'll let you guys know how that goes. Pass the battalion to Sarah.
Hi. I am feeling like I've just been in like 5 or 6 straight hours of Zoom calls, so I'm not sure. I don't know. Yeah, just I'm here. Yeah.
I was having a really interesting dream last night. I always find it interesting how some dreams I remember and like stick with me in the morning and some don't. So it's going to be really hard to describe it because it was a dream, but it's something to do with putting sticks into soil and like some of them instantly blooming and dying and then adding water and putting them in a different container and seeing what they do. I don't know. There's clearly trying to tell me something or for my brain to actually be figuring out possibly some of the work I'm doing, something to do with surprise, something to do with the quality of the soil, something to do with the mutability of beauty. I don't know. Blah. That's me.
I discovered that 3 trees we planted on our property that I thought were dead were alive on the weekend. So that's the first thing I thought of when you talked about sticks in the soil. It's like these little liquid amber trees which are actually green now. And I'm like, yay. Cool. What do people remember from last week's conversation and content? What were the big takeaways?
The intrinsic motivation stuck with me. I'm thinking about how it sounds weird to say like intrinsically motivating other people because that's just not intrinsic motivation, but like to help people realize, like, I don't know, give them a perspective that can help them motivate intrinsically. Like maybe show them a problem from a different angle that prompts them to tackle it as opposed to like avoid it. Like, I'm not up to this. like reframe it so that they're like, oh yeah, this is totally my next challenge. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about intrinsic motivation. I think it could be really powerful because I see it working in my own workflow, and it's when I'm intrinsically motivated, the work is just so much better.
Yeah, I will admit I haven't gotten through all 4 articles that were posted since I wasn't in yesterday's meeting, but I have quickly skimmed. I've read 2 and I'm skimmed the other ones, and I still have them open as tabs so that I get to them eventually. I've just been swamped with coding. But what I really did like that I quickly picked up was, one, that there's no such thing as a self-organized structure. I totally believe that. Humans are humans. There's no such thing. Like, even after, you always have to say thank you, and you always have to believe that everything you're asking people to do is a favor, even if you're their boss or manager or whatever. Just because a team's a team, people like to feel appreciated. And I did like the micromanaging. They didn't exactly say micromanaging, but they were saying like the best teams make decisions at the lowest levels, the executioner level, rather than like having all these like approval barriers. And having been in both systems, one with too many approvers and another one with no approvers, I definitely agree that the people with their hands in the dirt type of saying always have the best and fastest perspective and framework as to how to do work and how to do it effectively, and that they should be the ones really leading the charge rather than every decision having to be floated up to other people who don't necessarily understand what's going on, not for their own fault, just simply due to their not being so close to the product, you know. And I really like that part of the articles you sent. I'm sure there's more. I'll get to it. It's very interesting stuff. I really like this stuff. Kind of like emergence for teams.
I'll share my reflections from last week. I think the biggest thing for me that's been coming back into thinking about the certain challenges, you know, we face as a team are just on the sources of power, and like thinking about just, I think having a framework to think about them just helps you like sit with it and ground in it more deeply, like around whether it's power due to like information. That one's been heavily on my mind recently, and then also like reputation, as well as what was the other one, like just like power due to like skills or experience, right? And really reflecting on some of the challenges we have and analyzing it with that framework.
Yeah, it's I find I really used. Did you get a chance to watch the video, Susan?
I didn't watch the video, but I did take another look at and dive back into Bonnie's work, Benita's work on the power asymmetries. And Joshua, JV, and I have known Bonnie for a while, and actually, the way that she thinks, for me, rarely translates into something as beautiful as that article that JV posted about the power asymmetries. Sometimes I find her thinking to be a little bit impenetrable, but I think that the clarity in this particular article around, especially this line, when we allow people to continually negotiate the interplay of asymmetric needs and wants and skills and resources, then the organization is generative. And I think that that's something that sounds obvious, but is difficult to do in practice. So for me, it just all kind of hooks back into this idea of being conscious about what is really happening, and helping each other to kind of create the practice of actually noticing and making sense of what's actually happening in the moment when either complexity is emerging or clarity is emerging, and setting ourselves up to do this well. As Josh L. said, you know, things don't just organize. there's scaffoldings that if we're aware of them and we can help to amplify them, it can make our work so much more in flow and responsive to, like our dynamic natures.
I wanted to follow up on that with something interesting. We've had the privilege of having like every other week a call with Joe Lubin, who's actually like the nicest guy ever. Like, I have to say, I don't say that about many people, but he happens to be a very kind person. And he said something interesting that stuck with me. He said that there's a lot of side channel manipulation going on in consensus. And I've definitely been a victim of that, where I'm like on a group chat and then suddenly I get like one person side channel me and be like, hey, do this, and totally derail the group chat. And due to that asymmetry or power asymmetry, you're like kind of alone on it. You're like, I wish someone else would see this, and it kind of gives you this like feeling of like, oh, why does this person think that they could just execute like this? And why am I the victim of it? And on the other end of it, it's like, whoever gave this person that power, it brings other things to doubt, which is why I always like bring it into like Google Drive and stuff so that it's more plain. But as we get these new employees coming into our team, I kind of told them explicitly, like, hey, you can always come to me confidentially, because I would never want these new employees to get into that situation where they feel like they're alone, or there's like a one-on-one interaction that no one else knows about that's kind of souring things for them. Our team kind of like half of them bounced. So it's kind of like a 50% new team. So that's something that I've been doing with the onboarding chats. I've been telling them all like, hey, if anything happens, confidentially, you can come to me and I'll always defend you without ever telling anyone who's doing it. And that asymmetry has actually played out kind of to our detriment already. Like, like of just, I call it the secret, not that we're supposed to say any words, but like, I'm like, I don't want a secret actually coming around, like I don't want someone to feel like they're being bombarded in this level. And the other thing I noticed was just about like regular communication. Like, you have to be tactful and human in email communications, both externally and internally. Externally, it affects us because it's just a bad rep, I guess, for us. Like, no one wants to get these like stingy emails, and everyone can tell, especially when you write like 4 words in your email reply. Like, if you don't have time right now, do it later. I don't know. Like, why does it have to be so stingy? Even if you write, I don't have time. Like, okay, so do it later. And then the other part is just about being nice in your emails, being like, and then like being considerate of other people's time, and not like thinking that everyone can work at 10 at night because you said so, or doing work just because you can that you shouldn't. And I don't know, little things like that I've seen happen in our team that I'm like trying to make sure the new employees don't experience. Yeah. Joe Lubin said that about the side channel manipulation. I was like, wow, that's interesting. That's consensus wide.
That just ties into the tyranny of structurelessness that I say. Hierarchies exist in human systems, and if we don't make them explicit, they're implicit, and then they're harder to even change. And that was a huge takeaway from that essay. I thought it was really good.
Yeah, I find that particularly when people start using the language of self-organizing, hierarchy can become a dirty word, and it also becomes an unuseful word sometimes, I find, in that you'll see people talking about where hierarchies are good, and usually they're talking about clear delegations and formalizing the power structures and making them explicit. Whereas other people I see hear the word hierarchy and they just think power over others, the power to coerce. And I think they're quite different things. So often it's a word which I kind of steer away from and find it's not the most useful word to put in the middle of a conversation. There's lots of great threads there that I noticed. So one was around the sense of like, how do you help other people be intrinsically motivated is a lovely kind of paradox. And the way I think about it is I don't change other people, but I can change their environment. And I am part of that environment. So the way I behave shifts their environment. And so if I ask someone to do something, or if I say it's really important you do something, or if I say you should do this, I'm changing their environment in ways which will affect their intrinsic motivation. And to do that in a way where I find the idea of like, here's some options I see, which ones do you like the most, is often a really good way of coaching someone which preserves their autonomy. And saying, this is just what I see. You can ask other people what they see. It's up to you to determine what you want to do. And always coming down to that individual choice, that individual sovereignty as kind of a baseline value. And I find that's a really powerful way of protecting people's autonomy, though it takes some getting used to sometimes, because often, especially if you've got a lot of experience and you've got a lot of asymmetry when it comes to knowing the domain or the information, and someone says, hey, what should I do? And you say, you should do this. And you might be right, but by being right, you have undermined their autonomy a little bit and caused some very minor harm in the overall health of the team. So I find the way to navigate when you are in a more powerful position than someone else, gently, which preserves their autonomy and intrinsic motivation, but also doesn't waste time, doesn't make them build stuff from the ground up, and doesn't get them going off on a wrong path. So I find that's a really common dance that I've seen lots of. But that whole idea of I'm actually part of someone's environment and being a conscious part of that environment is a useful practice for me. I think that there's when Joshua was talking about no such thing as self-organizing, it reminded me of Francois Beauregard, he's done a bunch of work with Bonnie, and he loves the phrase of what's actually happening right now. So in a room, in a team, like what's happening, and he'll go so far as to say, like, you often might have a role of someone's facilitating this conversation, but that's a complete fabrication. All we have is people saying words to each other. Like what's actually happening is there are 5 humans on computers. We're saying words through the air. They're going through fiber optics and coming out of a speaker. And that's what's actually happening right now. Everything above that is our projection. Everything above that is our imagining of what's actually happening. And I find if you go to that level of a deconstruction, it's kind of not useful because you just have a very, not unuseful analysis of what's going on. But if you go to a very high level of abstraction, of like people are in roles and they're acting because of this and that, and I think Susan said that because of this, then it's too much. And there's this happy medium around where we can get to more of actually what's going on here, what's really happening in this group, by shedding as many abstractions as possible. And I find that that's a useful practice as well. There's a somewhat challenging one to find out what abstractions should we throw away and which ones should we keep is a useful thought there. There's a lot of what attracted me to self-organizing at the very beginning was the theoretical analysis of if you have a complex system and all the cognitive power is centralized and there's latency and loss with getting towards between the execution and the cognition, that seemed like an ineffective organism. Having an organism where the cognition and the execution are embedded together, and you actually can be very uncoordinated if the cognition isn't aligned. So the idea of using rich information systems and the culture that emerges on top of that to do cognition and execution on the periphery, but use cheap systems to align all that execution. That was the promise of self-organizing, which sort of got me on this journey. And I found it's somewhat true. It's also really hard. That whole alignment of independent actors when they're all busy and stressed in lots of ways is quite tough. But I do still believe it's fundamentally possible and better than centralizing cognition and separating it from execution. Yeah, I think that's probably the main takeaways I heard from those check-ins.
Yeah, I have an add-in. When I studied like social structures in college, they had a pretty good structure. They said that every team or pseudo team, like team in the most abstract of senses, kind of goes through the stages kind of like a child does, of childhood, adolescence. They called it storming, like where basically like every time a person either comes into a team or leaves a team, the team goes through the same period over and over again of like everyone first is like all happy and everyone tests the boundaries of what their responsibilities are, and then everyone sort of settles into it. And it was the point of that whole system was really to say that during the storming time, it's very important for leadership. Yep, that's exactly it. I'll find the article. I'm sure there's many on Google. But I remember the teacher saying that during storming, it's important to have leaders because at that time, if there's like a bad actor or someone who's negative, usually the people below him will sort of adopt his communication style and can kind of poison the system.
and that if a good leader is there during the storming, then once you get out of that stage, then the adulthood of the team would actually be quite positive. But that once it's solidified, it's quite hard to break out of what he called DNA. Like, you can't change the DNA of a company. That's what they used to say, because it's like a psychological thing. I'm sure there's other opinions about that, but I always thought that was very useful to thinking about, how to put someone into a team. I see it within our own team, how sort of people who work under others sort of start adapting their leaders' sort of language in emails, which it might not be positive, and there's sometimes like, it should be course corrected way before it becomes a solid behavioral pattern.
Welcome, Claudia. We just sort of finished reflections on biggest takeaways from last week's conversation and what we've been noticing, and and a general check-in. Anything you want to add to arrive?
Happy that I made it. I was
Cool.
scared I wasn't going to make it, so I'm glad I'm here. Nice to see everybody.
Yeah, wonderful. So just over an hour left. My main thinking was to introduce a few thoughts and concepts around the attention economy and how that's influenced as an underlying aspect lots of parts of self-organizing, and then to dive into where are people at with their health checks, where are people at with their interventions, their thinking of the team, and sort of have just a more practical conversation about what are you actually trying in your team and get everyone's heads on that sort of problem. Happy with that? Cool. So on one hand, what I've been trying to introduce each week, I guess, if you think about all the aspects of self-organizing, and there's lots of them, there's agreements, there's roles, there's bringing people into the team, there's managing information, there's just all these different aspects. What are some underlying mental constructs which you can apply to every one of them? And for me, power asymmetries is one of the ones which I can use to analyze any kind of intervention I'm doing. And I found that the attention economy is another one of those underlying ideas which shifts the way I approach most every situation. And the origins of, and the key idea here is that human attention is a resource, and it's scarce, and it needs to be budgeted and managed, is sort of the underlying definition if you Google attention economy. And it's a lot of it's in the idea of that as the amount of information has exploded, the thing which consumes information is now the scarce resource. So, and that's attention. Attention is the process which turns data into information in a way. And so if you dive into it, I found it's mostly sort of marketers and people who are reaching millions of people who really care about the attention economy, and they talk about it a lot. But I found it's really useful when thinking about teams and human organizing systems. So one of the things that I'll do if I'm analyzing an intervention, so I'm trying to think about, okay, my team wants to get better at feedback and I'm going to do something about that, is one of the ways to look at it is, what's the power structures look like? But another way to look at it is how much attention will my intervention require? So and often I find that attention is correlated with time. So if I said, hey, everyone, I want to do a 5-day workshop on feedback, no one would want to commit that amount of time to that intervention. It's just too big of an ask in terms of time. So it's quite easy when you start talking in time that people can engage and to think about it. But then it's not always correlated with time. If I said, hey, everyone, I want to make a really controversial decision in our team, which half the people like and half the people don't like, that's going to burn up a huge amount of attention because people will be having arguments, there'll be side channels, there'll be things going on. It's going to be an inefficient use of people's attention. Whereas if I pitched an idea which was pretty close to consensus already, and I've done a bunch of work, and it's like, yep, people will mostly go for this, it won't take too much attention and energy and to sort of get that over the line and everyone to say, yes, we want to do this, or I'm okay if you do this. So on one hand, I find that I'm always prioritizing my interventions by how challenging will this be to get alignment around. And that's where it's really important just to know individually, okay, where is each team member at? Where is the team at as a whole? And then I can start to evaluate interventions and sort of prioritize the ones which are going to be basically the trade-off between value and amount of attention it takes to get over the line. Because just doing easy stuff that's trivial isn't that valuable. and doing very few amount of hard stuff, which is very valuable, might not be the optimal path, and to try to find the optimal balance between value and the attention it burns. So that's sort of one way that I've practically applied this. Another one is the idea of, I don't know, one of the biggest thing I've learned in sort of sales work is that the most powerful words are words that people say themselves. So if I'm trying to build agreement or alignment of things, it's really crucial to get people's words and input cheaply very early on in the process. So instead of saying, okay, hey everyone, let's go do a half-day co-design session, it's more like, actually, can I do 5 one-on-one conversations with people? I'm thinking about this idea, it'll take 10 minutes, what do you think of it? Just tell me what you think. And I find that by getting those conversations early on, it can shape what I'm thinking and how I'm talking and where I'm doing things. But also, it's my attention that's being burned, not the team's. So you'll see there's an asymmetry. If I have 5 one-on-one conversations, 5 people have had a 5-minute conversation, which for them was very cheap, but I've done it 5 times in a row. What that does is that lets me iterate things. So each of those 5 conversations, I can change something. So I'm learning from the past ones. So I'm actually going through a learning process myself. And I find that whether it's a team or trying to do something mesh-wide in the sort of wider thing, by having something where I burn lots of attention and people burn not very much, I can have a learning process, and I've managed their attention economy quite well. So one, when I come back to them with another conversation, intervention, request, they've already heard the idea a little bit, they've been warmed up to it, and the fact that they've been warmed up to it means that it won't take as much of their attention the second time round. So when you hear something for the first time, particularly if it's a deeper or it has big implications, the fact that they've had a week worth of unconscious processing means it's cheaper for them to analyze than if I just went, bang, what do you think of this? So that's another very practical way that I've thought about it. So I remember in our first call, I think it was Micah was saying when we were talking about patterns for decision making, instead of making a decision, we're going through a design process. So reframing decision making to be a design process. And as soon as you do that, oh, okay, what are the design requirements? How do I get them from a lot of people? How do I get them so it's not really expensive for those people to give me those requirements? How can I keep them in the loop as my thinking matures? Because I find that there's a really common pattern in organizing where there'll often be like a core team of people who go really deep on something. There'll be a group of people who are affected by it and have opinions about it, but they don't go as deep. And there's a tension between these two teams or people. And that managing those tensions so that the people who go deep aren't slowed down overly much by the people who haven't gone deep, and the people who haven't gone deep have their voices fairly represented, but also are willing to follow. And so I'll pause for a little bit soon, but the key idea here is that often I think in self-organizing, it's as important to practice followership as it is to practice leadership. And it's as important to talk about it, and it's as important to get good at it as a skill. Because if I'm on the periphery and I see some other people going deep on something, I can behave in a way which supports that and be a good follower, or I can behave in a way where I'm kind of being a unhelpful follower. And it's like, even if my idea is good, maybe it's just the wrong time to share that idea. And helping people have that consciousness is what it takes to have a real dynamic interplay between leadership and followership and dynamic leadership emerging. And I think it's a fairly hard thing to do and takes people a bit of practice, because often if I'm invited into a design process later on and I've got lots of thoughts, I kind of just start going on the journey of going deep with people. But I do it 2 weeks after they've done it, and I start the journey all over again, and it just slows everything down. So learning about followership and leadership is, I think, another dynamic of this. So that's a slight tangent. So I guess that's sort of some initial thoughts and prompts about attention economies, leadership, followership in this work. Any thoughts, or what are your immediate reactions from that?
I find myself thinking about attention a lot. I mean, I didn't have it, this concept as clearly defined as you just expressed it, but like, I want to reduce the amount of emails that I send to my team about this stuff as much as possible, because the more emails I send, the less engagement I'm going to get, I feel. And that just ties directly in with this. So I totally hear what you're saying. And being strategic with what the emails, what I ask for when I send an email to the group, basically set everything up so I have a plan down the road, like a few weeks out, to make sure that I can not send out 3 emails in the afternoon saying like, oh wait, actually this. But yeah, this is helpful.
I think I'm a little selfish, which I can admit when it comes to emails and communication and human attention. I think I've sort of been wired to like get it out of my inbox, get it out of my area. And, you know, if I send 10 emails, even to the same people about 10 different things, I've like done my part. My OCD is good. But I never really thought about it, how that's unfair. It's unfair. And it's like, and then I'm following up and I'm not, which is another email on top of another email or Slack or something. So thinking of human attention as a resource and respecting that as well, it sort of ties into what we talked about regarding time, right? It's kind of like eye-opening. So to Josh's point, I think I want to work towards that, like being more mindful on how to ask for people's attention and not just assume that they can read 10,000 emails in 5 minutes.
I can say something. Joshua, you're like hitting on like the exact thing that I'm struggling with right now in my team. And yeah, I mean, it's just, I don't know if there's one right answer. There's obviously not one right answer, one wrong answer, but I'm just personally right now finding it very difficult to manage the attention economy of my team in a way that like I'm actually bringing something to them that they can give useful feedback on, but at the right times so they understand what's going on throughout the process. And like the whole comment around like leadership versus followership, it's easier said than done, right? Because so it's like I feel like I'm managing what you said, managing tensions. So I'm going deep on something and I'm managing the tensions around someone who hasn't gone deep on something. And some people are super cool with it and they're like, yep, like ready to like help when you're ready for me to help. And it's like very refreshing and it doesn't feel heavy. But then the people who are like freaking out, right, around this, I guess, followership role, and who haven't gone deep enough to even, I don't know, like, I mean, I don't know where I'm going with it. I'm just saying, like, I'm really like resonating with this topic right now. And
one of the biggest things I've found with managing the going deep and not going deep and the leadership followership dance is essentially who's in which circle. And so if someone's really passionate about a topic, it's going to be virtually impossible for them to follow along on that topic. They're going to need to be in the deep team. Otherwise, they'll just keep going deep after the fact, and it's kind of hard. And also, it's if someone is part of the deep team, but they don't have the time to allocate to it, and they can't go down, then you've got a fundamental tension there as well. And I think that for me, all this stuff I find the concepts are pretty easy. Doing them in practice, it's really hard because what it is, it's about constantly negotiating with peers where you don't have, so deep, I'm sort of talking about if you spend like 4 weeks researching the best feedback systems in the world, and you go really deep into all these options and you learn a lot about it, you see what other teams are doing, you talk to everyone in your team about it, you've gone really deep on a topic, you've built up a lot of context and knowledge. And if someone says, oh, I know you're doing that feedback stuff, and then later on, when you present a proposal, they want to start digging down deep into it as well. That's sort of what I mean by going deep, is building up context. And so the idea of if someone wants is sort of conceptually part of the deep team but can't put in the same amount of time, then you've got a time asymmetry to manage. And but at the heart, everything comes down to negotiating with peers who have all different motivations and skills and so on, and then trying to build alignment and trying to just constantly do deals. Okay, you part of this core team or you're not? Or do you want to support this proposal for everyone to do something or not? And there's always this sort of negotiation, this constant negotiation. And I think that's what in Benita's article she spoke about, was that constant negotiation with your peers is kind of the cost of emergence. It's the cost of self-organizing. And I think that a lot of, one of the things that I'm learning a lot at the moment is that a team needs to have this baseline allocation of resource to that constant individual negotiation for self-organizing to work. If that allocation isn't made individually or collectively, then it will be very difficult to have a self-organizing environment. And often it's people aren't aware of that when they jump into the journey, is what does it mean to spend 30 minutes a day or half an hour a day basically negotiating? And some people aren't up for that, and I think some people are, and that's one of the differences that I notice.
It's really interesting. It's like completely resonant. I was having a conversation with TJ Blanchflower yesterday. I don't know who knows this human in the mesh. In the design research team based out of Raleigh. And his noticing was maybe it's responsible for, I guess, the talent team or the recruitment team or anybody that's hiring anybody for the mesh to be very explicit up front to say, you will be, if you join this self-organizing thing, you will be wearing at least two hats. And one hat is the work that you do, and the other hat is some level of negotiated participation in building this thing. And I think that the mesh can go a long way to actually setting that expectation, because certainly from what I've seen, that expectation has not been set up front. So that if people can like come in prepared that yes, negotiating the thing will be part of the role. That could be super interesting. Another thing that was coming up for me during this conversation is like my responsibility around the commitments that I make and negotiating or being conscious of the demands I'm putting on others for their attention. So it's not only about like being sophisticated in thinking about how we position our requests, being conscious of other people's limited amount of attention. But how do we negotiate that internally with the commitments that we're making around the things that we need to deliver? And I think that's another aspect of it that is real.
Yeah, just to add to that, something that I've picked up that's been interesting is like just being respectful of people's time and respectful of like humans in general. I sometimes see that like just like someone is asked, an expert is asked for an opinion and he gives it and then there's no follow-up. And I'm like, a week later, I'll email the guy and I'll be like, was I not included in this thread? Was there a follow-up? I just wanted to reach out and be like, hey, like I want this also. And then I did the follow-up and I was like, why did this guy who's not even in our team spent all this time, giving us amazing advice, and it just fell through the cracks? Like we should have been much faster at the response of this individual's time. And the same goes for internal teams, external teams, but like that guy is not gonna return the favor next time, because his time and his expertise weren't respected. And any human would be like, hey, if it took you 2 weeks to respond to my very like nice email that I did for you, and no one even cared or respected my opinion, then, and it's even happened to me where I've mentioned things like 20 times and it felt like I was talking to a wall of some sort. And I was like, why is it that I have to repeat myself so many times saying the same thing over and over again? It seems like no one's listening, or no one feels that it's their responsibility to do anything about it, or that they just don't implement it. But I've seen it across other people that we contact, and I always see everything as a relationship. So like if you don't respect the relationship you have with others, they're not gonna, next time around, they'll feel that, you know. And it's important, especially in self-organized organizations and remote teams, to always keep that relationship very nice and cordial, and to say thank you and appreciate certain things and give them public acknowledgement of what they did. But yeah, like I keep a tab of all the email threads that are going on just to ensure that they're followed up on at some point, even if it's not my responsibility, because it's important to keep relationships healthy. But that's just about like respect of time, like not demanding too much from others, or at least giving them the flexibility to like execute when it's appropriate for their own life.
Like I've been guilty of that, definitely. I remember I was in a situation where a team member had sent out an email, and it was literally it was like 16 pages. It was a 16-page Google Doc, and I opened it and I was like, I will get to this. I just can't right now. And it fell through the cracks, and we had a follow-up meeting, and the teammate was like really hurt. And regardless of whether it was my intention, and I wasn't the only one that didn't address it, so I'm sure it felt even worse for this person. But it's like, how do you balance that? Like, instead of sending a 16-page email, maybe do like a TLDR version. But I don't think this person's capable of doing that. Like, I've seen this person's emails, and that's just how they work. So it's like finding that balance. Like, how do I tell this person, or I don't want to, when I saw that, I felt really bad. And I felt like, at least I'm going to send this person an email and say, this is really long, so I may not get to it right away, but please bear with me. And it also gave me a newfound respect, because I've done that, where I've sent an essay that I put a lot of time in, and I've gotten really upset that no one's responded. But especially working at Consensus, I've learned really fast that you have to get to the point. And yeah, so I'm trying to also like do it as well, and be respectful, and also in both ways.
Yeah, some things I've noticed there is because I've done I've noticed a lot of us at Inspiral have done a huge amount of coaching with our peers around verbosity, just how many words do they produce, whether it's in Slack, whether it's in Lumia, whether it's in emails, whether it's in Zoom calls. And over time, I find as people spend longer in this sort of communications culture, they get better at being brief, and it's an absolute skill. It's an ability. And so I wouldn't just write off and say that's the way someone else works. I would sort of identify and say, actually, it's twice as hard to turn a long essay into a short one. I think that was a Mark Twain quote in a way. And that it takes more energy to do that. It's more effort, but it also takes more skill. And sometimes people might not have the energy or effort or skill. Another thing I've noticed is, and so in that case, it's really just it's kind of, how do you help people get that? What are some practical points? Okay, I read your essay. Here are the 4 points in the summary that would have made it easier for me. Or doing the generous work of reading someone's long thing and turning it into a short thing so that the rest of the team can engage with it more. There's another very practical thing to do when I see someone doing this. So giving people clear feedback and requests is like, okay, that's really long, but I really value what you've done. Because often the amount of words someone produces is how much they care about a thing. They're kind of correlated. So when someone produces a lot of words, the first thing is to acknowledge them as a person and their efforts. Is like, thank you so much. I love the thinking you're doing. I really appreciate it. I have no time to read this right now, but here, can we book in a time to talk through it? There's some quite practical things to do around that. And I think a lot of it's just about managing, letting people know that they're seen and they're heard, even if the way they're behaving doesn't work with the attention economy that I'm in.
Yeah, I think that speaks a lot to people with preference for, I guess, extroverted sense making and introverted sense making. I've often found, I know that for me, my preference is to make sense of a question or the world or an opportunity through actual synchronous dialogue. And for me, if I'm looking after my own attention economy, I know that booking out the time to have a half-hour conversation with somebody will get me miles ahead of where I would have been if the sense-making was asynchronous, or that I was allowing for people with a preference to do introspection and reflection, and then maybe write their reaction or their response to a particular question. So I think that's another thing that I've learned, is how to respect people's preferences for the way they make sense, and manage my expectation around that as well. It's not always easy for me because my preference is to just have a conversation and move on. But I know that not everybody makes sense of the world like that.
Yeah, I will say that I'm kind of guilty of that, just because I'm not a very good conversation over text person. Like, I don't like say like, hi, how are you? Good. Like, for me, I'm always coding. So like every word I write is like expensive for me. So I'd usually just write everything, in one message. Like, okay, like they usually send me some emergency, which I don't think is an emergency, but I respect that they do. And then I write, listen, according to the very little information you gave me, here was my thought process. This is how I figured it out. And this is the conclusion. And I always think that's better, because like, if I just wrote the conclusion, then it would seem a little terse, like, hey, here's the answer, one-liner, like, don't do this, or no, or yes. So I always think that it's better for me to be like, listen, these are the clues you gave me. This is what it led me to. This is how you can verify it. And here is the conclusion based on those clues and how I got to that conclusion. But I know that not everyone appreciates that, because they just see like a massive 2-paragraph essay, which might make sense to me, but maybe they can't follow it, and I also just want to send one Slack message, and have them just send me one back and just be done with the conversation, kind of, because I have to get back to coding. So like, but I do recognize that I've tried to lower that a little, because maybe people aren't interested in it, or maybe they don't care. But I have been guilty of I call it the Megillah, like just, like, I try to write in a very nice way though, just saying like, listen, especially when people send me emergencies with absolutely no clues, like something bad happened. I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, and then I have to like deduce what it couldn't have been, and then find out what it is, and I'm like, if this was such an emergency, why didn't you like screenshot it, or like give me any sort of clue as to what was going on at all? Like, I have to become investigator Magoo here, like, I don't know. It's interesting. But then to respect that they think it's an emergency is important too, because if it's their emergency, it should be mine too, I guess.
One the thing that some of these bring up for me is that as individuals in a sort of self-organizing team, I find that I really only have 2 levers, because only so much, well, there's 3, I'd say. One is myself. I can control what I do. I can look at and reflect and learn about myself and change my behavior. And that might change my sphere, my world, but it's not going to have a direct impact on much of my colleagues' world. And so much of my well-being and effectiveness in a team depends on my colleagues. And these are colleagues with different levels of self-awareness or skills or abilities or knowledge of all these sorts of things. And when it comes to my colleagues, I basically have 2 levers: feedback and requests. And I find that one thing that's really useful in terms of attention economy, and also really useful in feedback, is basically small direct requests for consent. Is like, hey, Susan, I have some feedback about this call we were just on. Do you want to hear it? And just by asking that before jumping in and saying, here, I have some feedback for you, and here it is, it's immediately asked their consent about, actually, is Susan too busy right now? Does she even have the 2 seconds it takes to get into the frame of mind of, oh, there's some feedback and maybe it's really bad and I'm going to get ready for it. And then usually it's positive feedback and they're quite surprised. But it's just the idea of, one, giving people feedback And I find that some of the intentions for giving feedback is, one, here's something about me you might not know. If you're working with me, maybe a voice call would have been much easier than a big text message. That's just my preference. That's how I work. That's often really good feedback for someone to have. I'm not asking anything of you. I'm just giving you some feedback about how I work. The second type of feedback is, here's some feedback about you. I noticed that you did X, Y, and Z, and I'm providing that as grit for Susan's self-awareness mill. Maybe she knows this, maybe she doesn't, but here's some feedback which is an offering so you can get to know yourself a bit better. And I find those two types of feedback start to become when you've got them clearly, they become very clear interventions to make in changing the way my colleagues work with me. And then the level up from that is, here's a request. Actually, it would have been much easier for me if this was a written essay. Could you please write it up in the future rather than organize a call, or those kinds of things. So making direct requests to colleagues is kind of like the most forceful thing to do in a self-organizing group. And it's something I don't do as much as feedback, but it is a way to sort of to shift things a little bit. We've got a little bit of time before we change phases. I guess, are there any questions that are live for people around this topic, or anything else that you sort of want to get the group to dig into?
I think feedback is a big topic. So I have a lot of thoughts on it. So I don't know if we're going to go over that in the pilot, or if it's even applicable. But I think, and then really feedback is in everything, right? And it just always ties back to that in some way, like when we're talking about respecting time, or, roles or power symmetries, feedback kind of always ties back. So, yeah. I don't know if that was helpful. I just was thinking it and just shot it out. So.
I don't want to hear anything you have to say.
You don't want to hear anything I have to say?
No, I do. I'm always curious.
There's feedback. You got it.
It's an open forum.
I was just going to say, to Joshua's point before, there's a team in Consensus, Catalyst, and they're all about feedback. And I've been blessed enough to be a part of their calls just to listen in. And one of the things they do is, after every meeting, there's sort of this automatic email that goes out that says, hey, how was that? And give me any feedback you want, which I find really brave. What's interesting, though, it ties back to attention, though, because they're trying to do a peer feedback system within themselves. There's like 70 of them, and they each have their own like a survey, like a Google form, and it takes like 10 minutes. But when you do the math, it comes out to like 18 hours if you were to do a form for each of them, right? Mm-hmm. So it's important, but they're really trying to find a way. Like they're working with each other, and it's pretty incredible. But it's interesting how asking for feedback could also be considered you're competing with time, Whereas if you get someone on the spot, like, hey, how did I do? Just to give it to me right now. How did I do? Might be more helpful, but it's just something I thought about. And I thought about doing that too, like having a little link on my email, like, tell me how I'm doing. Or there's people on Slack that have it on their names. Like, click here, tell me how I'm doing. But if it's not like obvious, it's easy to miss that.
This is where I think this is a lovely intersection between attention economy and feedback. So for example, if I send someone an email and it sits in their inbox and it's a request for feedback, that's one kind of thing of the attention economy. If I'm walking along with someone and say, hey, how'd you find that? That's a different use of the attention economy. It's also like a UI problem. If they have to know that the link at the bottom of my email exists and notice it and click on it and do something, that's a different kind of slipperiness or engagement profile. And the biggest thing I find about if you're wanting to lead and cause change in a self-organizing way, you kind of need to have a whole bunch of skills. And I think one of the really useful skills is around facilitation and convening groups. Like, I've got a bunch of people, I've got the attention. How do I manage that well and effectiveness so people have a great time? Super useful. Another one is essentially the skills of a communications professional. And if you look at how much thought marketers put into the subject lines of emails, or what they put in first, or how do they make it clear how well this thing relates to the person they're talking to, and it's all about them and not just about you, and all those kinds of things, which channels do I hit? How often do I hit them? Is this a Slack message? Is this an email? Is this an in-person conversation? Is it a calendar booking? Like, they're all tools you have, but essentially it boils down to being a communications professional and investing in those skills and realizing, actually, how can I get better at how I communicate? And how can I write better or shorter or whatnot? And I think for me, all of this sort of comes down to I guess, a general view on self-organizing, which it demands a lot of capability to perform at the highest levels, and it demands a lot of capability from everyone in the team. That if everyone in the team understands things like attention economy, power asymmetries, leadership and followership, then you can start to have a lot of things available, and that capability will never be evenly distributed. There'll always be some people who are just much better at that, and other people who might have pieces of it but not other pieces. So when it comes down to it, fundamentally, the heart of self-organizing is designing an environment where people can grow their capabilities really quickly. So that, say I have no concept of how to write shortly or how to write briefly or tersely, and I'm just not very good at that. How, by just being part of your team, would I receive coaching, advice, feedback, suggestions in a way which is easy for me to see and easy for me to act on, so that I get really good at that? And how would that happen for how I think about followership and leadership or resolving conflict, so that my individual capabilities increase rapidly by being part of the team? And I think that's probably the heart of everything. Like, if you're not doing that, it's going to be very hard to make it stick. But if you are doing it where that works, then it kind of doesn't matter which problems you're having, because eventually your humans will grow through those problems. Any final thoughts, or happy to shift gears? All right. So this is very much, let's get a bit more practical. What's actually going on in your teams at the moment? It could be health check things. It could be interventions you're planning. So updates from the teams and where you're at. And I guess, what questions or ideas would you like to bounce off everyone here to sort of sharpen them up?
Yeah, I can start, just because there was one thing that really stuck out to me that I wish, I don't want to point anyone out, because I think it's more than one person, and I wouldn't want this to snowball, but I wish there was a workshop called, that everyone in my team would take, so that no one would be singled out, called How to Write, I don't like the word political correctness, but like how to write an amicable email, right? That like is pleasant to read, I guess. Like, I took a 2-day break this week, Monday and Tuesday. So I get back to my emails, and I read some email threads that I was like, why? Like, I was like, oh, who would ever write this way? And it's not, like, I don't know if it's that person's fault. I don't know if it's like a language barrier. This person seems to try to want to work on it, but doesn't quite get there. I see that he's making an effort, but at the same time, it's just not there, like, and anyone who would read this email thread would be a little like, I don't even want to be involved in this. Like, this is like bad, like, I even was like laughing almost at the email thread. And
was it like offensive or just that
kind of offensive, I have to say. Kind of like sandpapery. I don't even know how to describe it, to be honest. Almost like personal. I don't know. And it wasn't directed at me, but I know that the person responding is a very nice person. I happen to know this person personally. And he responded kind of in a sarcastic, like, hey, I'm going to pinch you back type of way, which is kind of funny. He did it in a funny way, but like, it's like that, like, hey, you're asking something from someone else, but you yourself didn't do any research into it. And that was the answer he got back, of course. But like it's like pushing the ball to the other court, and then being not respectful of that person's time, especially knowing that we're going on parental leave. Like, anyone who has gone through that knows how crazy that time is for anyone. Even before you go on parental leave, it like escalates incredibly, so like, it's like, when I read that email thread, I was literally like, when you're ashamed of something and you just can't look up, you're like, You're like, when something happens and you just can't face it, you're like, oh my gosh, this is so shameful. I don't even want to be involved. But like, I wish that like my team would take an amicable email writing workshop. That's the gist of it.
So what would people's ideas be in that situation?
Feedback.
I have a question
Yeah.
for Joshua. If you were to, whatever the conversation was about, like we don't really know, would you think that email is a place for that conversation? And if not, what would be the way that you think that conversation could have been had, like method, like in person, in a Zoom call, on a Slack channel, like in a letter stamped by, sent through the US Postal Service? Like, where could that conversation have been to the point where you could have understood where he was coming from?
I think like the number one problem was that he didn't even take the time to try to answer his own question. Like if you went on Google in 7 seconds, the first link would have been the answer. And then he just pushed it onto someone else. And that person was like, okay, we'll Zoom call about it. And then they emailed back saying like, I don't understand why you can't just give me the answer. And the person answered back like, just Google it, dude. Here's a screenshot. First link. There's the answer. So it just showed like a lack of preparation or a lack of time committed to this. And then the email way that he even asked was very personal and rough. Like, please, why is it so hard to give me this information? And I was even taken aback by the answer or the language that was in the email. Like, I didn't think it was appropriate at all. Like, this could have been solved. And this, by the way, has been a month-long thread. Like, it's like, and it was something very important, to be honest. It was an important decision that could have been solved 2 months ago with a Google email. And it just, suddenly these 2 weeks it was resolved. But this guy's very good and he does a lot of favors for us. And he actually controls our entire IT budget. Like, this shouldn't have been thrown onto his plate. Like,
to Sarah's point, like, and I've seen this personally, professionally, like, in email's not for everything, and whenever I feel something tense brewing in an email, my first inclination is to say, could we just get on a call? Like, I don't want to read through 10 pages of your feelings because they're going to be hurtful, and maybe you just need to think about it, right? Like, I'm not going to go on a call and say, you're an asshole, excuse my language, because I'm going to think about it, right? And I'm going to look at someone's face and see that they're not trying to be mean or hurtful, that they're coming from a place of stress as well. So that's always my go-to. Hey, let's just get on a call. This should not be personal. I'm happy to help you, but I'm also overwhelmed. Let me understand where you're coming from. And in an email, that doesn't translate. And I, just on a personal, like, this is the thing I started with my family. Because my family, they just love to write these pages of emails of their feelings. And I'm like, dude, it's not that serious. I'm just asking you to pick up milk. Like, what's the problem, right? So I don't like to, and I've seen, if you don't take that initiative, it just gets so out of control. And not you, Joshua, like, I'm not saying you should take the initiative, but it's almost like a conversation, like a team agreement. Hey, if this is getting heated or if this is brewing, let's just get on a call, just have a conversation, and let's understand where we're coming from.
The language I have around that is escalate the bandwidth. And so the idea of, and I got this from the programming community around how to deal with conflict in terms of communication platforms. And essentially, if I'm in email, go to synchronous text. If you're in synchronous text, go to synchronous voice. Or synchronous video. And then if that's not working, then go to in-person meeting. And if that's not working, go to a mediated in-person meeting. Just keep escalating the bandwidth of the container that you're holding, or the way the communication is happening can profoundly change the type of communication that happens.
Yeah, Joshua, I feel like this is an opportunity to ask consent for feedback. Just like ask the person, like, hey, like, you're involved in this conversation, like, you're in the thread, right? So you can be like, hey, I have some feedback about this thread. Would you like to hear it? And then you can say like, I'm just observing this conversation and I feel like you can tell them like this feels sandpapery to me. Like it just doesn't feel like it's on point, and maybe like suggest this increasing bandwidth if something gets a little prickly, like to say, hey, can we increase the bandwidth of this conversation? Because maybe the person doesn't know that, doesn't feel the same way about the conversation. They don't realize that they're doing something that might feel a little off to some people, or just like, yeah, I feel like it's a good opportunity to provide feedback.
One of my noticings is that Joshua's first impulse was, I'd love if the team had a whole thing on how to write good emails as a way of avoiding the process of giving someone individual feedback, because I find that often it's really easy when something bad happens. Lots of people can feel bad about it and it can impact them, but the cost of actually doing something, such as I'm going to talk to this person, I'm going to email them, I'm going to do something, it's an expensive thing to do. And when you've got lots of other things to do, it's kind of hard to prioritize it and hard to see how important it is. And it's an example of what I meant by there's a baseline of work that everyone in the team needs to do to make self-organizing work. And by kind of having like an hour a day budgeted or half an hour a day budgeted, you can look at options. And one of them might be, talk to this person about direct feedback. Another one might be put this proposal forward to the team about a new process. Another one might be respond to someone's request for something. But there's all this labor that needs to happen by everyone in the team, or at least by the majority of the team, for it to be a conducive environment. And for if a culture of feedback is hard and it's not normal to give people feedback, then the first time you do it, it's the most expensive, and the second it's a bit cheaper, and the third it's a bit cheaper. And the whole idea of asking for consent and actually investing the energy in this person, it's a sign of like caring for that person in a way. That if my colleague's got a habit which is unhelpful, then it's actually a very generous thing for me to do, to say, actually, can I help you be better at that? Or how can we do something so this doesn't happen again?
Yeah, I guess the reason that I said that it should be team-wide was because I've seen this. So we're like an 8-person team, or 15 officially, but let's say like 8 are external facing. And I've seen this pattern across 2 out of the 8. And there's 3 others, which I'm not aware of how they communicate, but they're under this person, which to me means that they might be adopting some of the language. And due to our position as like a very external team, plus even our internal communications are kind of external, since we're 1,000 people team, 1,000 people group, like I feel like everyone would benefit as making this a standard. I even went so far as to say that any external email should go through a person who's an expert at email writing, so that there's at least externally, there's some sort of uniformity across the communications we do externally. I'm in some of those external emails, and I'm even like worrisome about it. Like this individual happened to do an okay job externally, but it could have been done better. And it's important. These are business deals that are going down. And like any professional would have known, like I think that professionalism means being good at communication. Like everyone can do their individual jobs well, but can you communicate well and make sure that the deals are going through? That's a direct impact to our bottom line, which kind of worries me. And I guess the second part was that these individuals are kind of at the leadership level of our team, and I'm at the bottom of the totem pole. So I feel a little uncomfortable, I guess. Like you said, the first time you give feedback is a little rough, especially if you know that the person might not be 100% conducive to it, just due to like intuition and character. And I guess, but I do understand what you're saying about like that first time is the hardest, and maybe you're right. Maybe I should flag it. Josh, I just sent you the email since you're in my team. I felt that it would be okay to send to you. But if you want, I'll show you. Like, I'll copy, paste, and remove the names just for you to see more or less what I'm talking about. Maybe I'm totally off.
But I think my feeling is that you've got a lot more context, and your calculus of what's appropriate or what not is probably more appropriate than ours. And I didn't want to imply that. Definitely jump in and give some people feedback. But has the thoughts been useful for you?
No, very. And I'm very gentle and soft and kind of don't usually do. I know myself. Like, I'm not like the person who's like, hey, dude, you did that wrong. Like, I'm usually the person who says, like, it should have been my fault. I should have caught it beforehand and, managed it myself to a certain extent. But
Maybe I have maybe a suggestion for you. Maybe rather than give the feedback on the emails, just maybe next time you talk to this person, you could just say, hey, like, I noticed that there was like a long thread going through, but the solution was like quite simple. And like, I just felt like it took a lot of my time to go through this email and then realize like that, you can just talk about yourself and talk about what you're noticing and really like, see where this person was.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Claudia, you're correct.
One of the things I would say would be, whenever I show up, it's always better to listen than speak. And the first thing whenever I'm giving feedback is to ask someone, hey, this happened. What was your perception of it? What were your thoughts? Because if they say to me what I was going to say anyway, then me saying it first would have actually been harmful. It can start to undo their thinking a little bit. Whereas if it's just hearing their perception of it, I also might learn stuff which wasn't obvious to me about other aspects of it. So whenever I am giving feedback, particularly the harder it is, the first thing would be to ask questions. What was your experience of XYZ event? And navigate from there. Does anyone else have something they want to put in the middle for the sort of last section?
Yeah, I had something.
Thank you everyone for your feedback. I'll definitely be implementing this.
Are we pivoting to a new topic maybe, potentially?
Yeah, you want to go, Josh?
Yeah, so we're going through the health check, and I facilitated a conversation about the health check that everybody did. And then Joshua and I had a meeting with another member of our team the next day. And so we had this, it was basically a public conversation, just amongst the team, but there were people on the team that felt like they didn't want to participate in the conversation because then their opinions would be known, and they felt more comfortable if everything was completely anonymous. And I guess my initial reaction was a little bit of frustration, because I think conversation is a great way to collectively come to a decision, and basically just filling out an anonymous form it's not conducive to a conversation. It's just like, this is my thought, these are my thoughts, and then we can like publish them, and everybody just has their chunk of thoughts, and everybody has to go through it later. And then we kind of decided that we'll just do it again with an anonymous form. But then I'm like, the reason that concerns me is because we're basically just taking more of our team's attention to do the same thing we just did. The results will probably be largely the same, I'm assuming, but there might be some differences just because it's going to be totally anonymous from beginning to end, and the structure is just slightly different. There's not a conversational piece. So yeah, it's just kind of like a weird situation. I don't know. I don't want to send out the form again because it's just the attention thing. And I see the person's point about being anonymous, not feeling available to speak up during the conversation. I just don't know how to handle it.
Josh, are you surprised by that? That there's, especially after the retreat, are you surprised that, or maybe that's not what I want to ask. Maybe that isn't what I want to ask. Were you surprised by that request? The anonymity request?
Yeah, I was, because I feel like our team is very close. Like we have 4 new people on our team, but they just didn't participate as much just because from a lack of experience, and it was kind of assumed that was how it would go. Like the older team would have this conversation, and it would help the new members get up to speed and just like see the cadence and people's thoughts, and like kind of rehash some of the topics we went over at the retreat, just to like reiterate some team culture. But yeah, honestly, I was surprised that there were people that felt like there are people that feel like they can't speak up and participate. which I guess is a problem in itself. Like we need to create an environment where everybody feels like they can contribute, I think.
I'll chime in because I was one of those people, since
Yeah.
Josh and I are on the same team. And I sort of felt that like half the team would feel that way, I guess, or some sort of people would feel that way. Maybe because I'm like naturally an introvert and also because of the power asymmetry. Maybe it's PTSD from my corporate jobs before this one, but like whenever someone is in a position to dictate your compensation and dictate sort of your work and dictate sort of other things, I'm always very hesitant to give that person feedback. Maybe because I wasn't allowed to it in the past, or because that person had an overriding, they could override my grade, let's call it, which would determine my bonus at the end of the year. So I always was very cautious about what I said. And they would give you the feedback straight up their words. And I knew who wrote what. Like I would read the feedback and I could hear the voice. So like I knew who wrote what. And with that power asymmetry, it's kind of intimidating, you know, and I guess that's how I felt. So I assumed that maybe a couple of others would feel the same way. And having the health feedback scores public is kind of intimidating also. Like I was honest about it because I wanted to be as honest as possible, even knowing it would be public, but it definitely went against my natural inclination. And having the co-leaders have this sort of silo where I don't really know what they're up to also makes me nervous because I don't know what they're doing, you know? And I guess the second thing that worries me about the co-leaders also is sometimes when I see them micromanaging people, the first thing that I think of is, aren't you supposed to be doing something else? Like, isn't there something else that, like, you're responsible for our jobs. You're responsible for bringing work in. Like, there's 12 people who are counting on you to bring work in and make a living. And that's very important, right? Like, I take my job very importantly. I have a family, I have responsibilities. And, like, I've been in situations where the leader sort of lost sight of that and the team had no work to do. And it was definitely the leader's fault. You know, like that's their job. Their job is to find work for us. So whenever I see them micromanaging me all day for 2 weeks, I say, what are you doing? Like, where's your time being allocated? Like, is this really that important? But then you can't voice that because it's difficult to, or at least it's difficult for me to do it in a public setting. That's just my personal take.
So I think it's definitely interesting. It's a tricky situation. The sorts of things I would think about would be one, talking to people one-on-one. Actually, what are the drivers? And I think that's, look for sort of example, the value hearing from Joshua. Actually, this is why I would like it to be confidential. Is you understanding that will shape what the next proposal you do is. And because I start to think about things like it's critical that people feel safe in a team if you're doing things transparently. And if there isn't the feeling of safety, that's your problem. And that unless that's addressed, it's going to be impossible to do things in a fully transparent way. I also think about wherever you're at is where you're at. So if people aren't feeling safe, then it's a case of what are the interventions which would move that forward a little bit, but understanding what are the dynamics of it. I found that if you've got big power asymmetries, it's really important to have genuine buy-in and genuine signaling from the people with the power. That for safety, for other people to feel safe, you need it takes action from them, and you might be able to influence that in a more or less way. So I think that's one of the things I think is a precursor to a safe environment is that the people with power in that environment are actively trying to make it safe for people. The other one I think about is that you can think about the size of your bubbles. So it might be that having a full team transparent thing doesn't work that well, but could you figure out a sub-circle? Could you do it within a sub-team of 4 or 5 people and have them, maybe it's not writing down numbers together, maybe it's just having the conversations together might be the place of it. Because what's important is the conversations in that process. And I think your intuition's really right there. So you could say, let's do all the numbers anonymously and let's do all that stuff. But then let's get into groups like this. And I want these 3 people here and these 4 people there. And you could design those groups. So it's less of a full team conversation, and it's more of a subgroup conversation. And you might get more honesty because that group feels safe with each other. That might be a practical way forward.
I really like that. I think that there's like natural subgroups in our team that would work well for, right, Josh?
Yeah, it's just I'm thinking, but it's tricky because like I thought this initial thing was gonna work well, and then it doesn't. So it's like, okay, maybe I need to like wait a little bit, like let people's attention like recharge or whatever, and before I have another ask. But it's like each thing that we try is another attention tax on people. So it's like you have to be strategic in what you propose to the group. But
did you get a sense of what was the most important priorities from the first time you did it?
Yeah, I mean, we said feedback from the people that were participating. Part of the problem was like half the team didn't show up, just for various reasons, which it's like was the lowest turnout meeting we've had in months. But it's just it is what it is. But we decided on feedback from the people that were participating, and then we pretty much have like the A-OK from the team. Like we can start designing interventions to do feedback. So if we do take, and Joshua and myself and another teammate are going to do kind of design an intervention around feedback, create some structure, maybe create a cadence and structure for feedback on the team.
Because I feel like if you've got that, then what's the purpose of doing the health check again? Because in one way, it's just like maybe focus all of your energy on the feedback intervention and kick that along, and maybe that's going to be a 3-month rollout plan. Like if you look at the full circle leadership, you can start to get a sense of actually what are the stages, who needs to be involved in which stage, and you've got a plan. And then it might just be all about implementing that one change. And once that change is kind of underway and you've got people moving forward on it and it's got its own momentum, that might be another time to say, hey, everyone, let's do that. That's happening. We're looking at feedback. Let's do another health check. And you can experiment with a different health check formula or format. And then you can start to say, let's prioritize another area. So we've got 2 things going in parallel. Might be, because then you get to delay the time before you do the next health check. So you're not doing as much repetition. But you do have a sense of forward momentum on one topic that everyone did, which sort of builds everyone's confidence in the process the team is doing together. So you're building buy-in and confidence like, hey, this thing is actually working, we're seeing change. Then it's easier to tackle the next one.
Okay. Yeah, I like that.
Those are some thoughts.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts people want? Oh, we're getting it back here. Any other thoughts people want to drop in before we jump into a checkout and reflections?
I have a question. Just something that's stuck in my mind from you, Joshua, is when you were talking about the individuals on the team who you call the leaders, that are the ones that are responsible for finding work for the team. Do they actually have the designation of leader, or do they just have roles that are they just doing tasks, and are they in roles that are about finding work for the team? Or are they explicit leaders?
So that's part of my concern, to be honest. It's that they are called co-leaders explicitly, but their role is very fuzzy. I've asked several times for like a sort of like list of what they're in charge of. I've been the victim of them sort of swooping in last minute and being like, hey, I have to approve this. Why did you do this without me? You must do this sort of procedure, which I never even knew about and they've never even been involved in for the past 8 months. And suddenly they self-elected themselves as the approver of something. And they explicitly said, like, this must be this way. And I was very taken aback by that. I was like, and then they wrote so much about it that at the end I was like, okay, no problem. It won't cost me so much to ask for approval on this. But then it sort of conflicted with what the experts were saying, like explicitly. And I actually messaged the expert and said, hey, dude, this is happening. I think I should loop you in so that you could sort of swing the pendulum back, because I agree with you more, because they don't seem to be listening to me. And it sort of worked, but I just don't know where they got that power from. and I'm not the one to challenge them, maybe due to my own weakness, but and the fact that they self-elected themselves as this sort of approver into something that's very micromanagey. I didn't understand where it came from. And the second part was, what else are they doing? Like, I'm not clear on what their role is. I'm clear on what one of the three roles are, but the other two are very fuzzy. And I don't know why it happened that way or where it came from.
Okay.
And their work is in a cloud. Like, I don't understand what's going on there, which kind of, and that I don't know how it'll change over time. I'm wondering, when will the next election be? Will there be a different structure? Who's in charge of that? It seems like these decisions are made outside of my scope for some reason.
Okay, thanks. I just needed. I just was curious about that. Thanks.
Cool. Yeah. So hopefully that sort of practically focused things was useful for folks. And I would encourage you, whenever you're starting to come across like a problem, a challenge, or an intervention you're planning, zooming out and thinking about power asymmetries, thinking about the attention economy, thinking about how you want to respond. Hopefully there's some useful things for you to sort of try out. Do we want to go into a round of check-ins to wrap up? I can kick off again. Really enjoyed the conversation. Like, it's just, I find that what comes up for me mostly is just how multidisciplinary this work is and how many different areas there are to understand. But just really exciting to see, I guess, the way people are grappling with ideas and the way you're trying to implement them in practice is quite inspiring for me. And so, yeah, really keen just to hear more about your journeys and looking forward to continuing in this work. That's me. Let's go with Claudia.
So yeah, it was a great conversation today. I think I picked up a lot of learnings. I have a lot of thoughts about how it applies to my team. And I'm very hopeful. And also to hear other people's perspectives has been really great too. So yeah, I really enjoy this. I'm almost sad that it's going to be ending soon. Susan.
Thanks. What's coming up for me super strongly, because I was just pinged on something talking about attention economy just before this, around like where are the resources? How what is the what are the agendas? Like what and I think, Joshua, you and I have been doing a lot of internal exploration around what exactly is this Team Foundations course. And I really appreciate your kind of focus on holding the space for what needs to emerge and what's the most important to be the thing that we're talking about, rather than having a prescriptive kind of methodology where we're assuming what is important to the teams that we're working with. So I'm super curious about how we market this in a way that is attractive to people in the attention economy, makes sense, and allows for the important work. Because as I always say, it's very difficult to sell emergence. Sarah.
Yeah, good segue. I was actually thinking the same thing because along the lines of like this conversation being super emergent today, and as much as like we talked through a lot of the academy teams like issues, I got a lot of parallel insight into like some of the things that we're working with as well, right? So I can the emergence is allowing for a level of just like groundedness and like, oh, this is how I can work on this specific issue or problem or challenge that we're facing in a team. But then how do we sell emergence back for this next round too? That's also top of mind for me too. Passing to Josh.
Yeah, going off of that, Sarah, I'm grateful to have this space like with you guys to talk about this, because just having the support and then being able to just talk through it is hugely beneficial. And I think that could be a selling point to other teams, is like, hey, this is just like a space where you can talk about stuff. Like most of you guys aren't on Academy, and it is helpful to have Joshua here who is on Academy, so we can relate to each other and like we sync up together about the things we talk about in this meeting after this. So it helps bring these ideas to Academy, but also just like, yeah, having the space is super beneficial. I'm grateful. So thanks.
Yeah, I have to say that a good selling point for this would be like a psychology about teams. I think that it's very helpful to hear JV's just general suggestions about our real world in the ground problems instead of having like philosophical abstract conversations. And I really appreciate that this is kind of like a safe zone, I feel. And Josh and I are trying to create that safe zone in our own teams. And I think that just modeling our very structure that you've sort of created here and the way you facilitate it, JV, is awesome. Like, I feel that you listen to us and you give us really good feedback that Josh and I always talk about after and really try to implement right away. And I really much appreciate this sort of safety area.
Cool. No, it's yeah, I find it's super rich. So I'm quite curious about what to do after Team Foundations. So quite open to suggestions or requests, but thinking about what would support you to continue your exploration of these topics. And yeah, so that's one thing I'd love to hear feedback on. And so next week, my plan is the topic is like making it meshy. And it's a little bit thinking about actually, how do you go beyond just thinking about your team to the engagement and this thing in the wider mesh? And this was a little bit of a segue into that. And but yeah, so yeah, it'd be fun. And I keen to chat with Susan and others around what actually would be good to support you as you continue the journey over the next few months.
JV, can I just ask you, when you have a chance, if you could Slack us that communication tier you talked about, like email, whatever.
I didn't hit enter on my my message. What I'll do is I'll write up a pattern in the wiki around escalate the bandwidth of the communications, and I'll put that in the communication section. And it's a super. I find people can understand that really quickly, and you can explain it once, and it's pretty easy for a team to start adopting that, and it's not very complicated.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, team. I've got some other people chomping at the bit to get into this meeting room. See you next week. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.